And today we are talking with Dr. Arthur Agaston, author of the South Beach Diet and also now the new South Beach Diet Gluten Solution. Dr. Agaston, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Chris.
So, Dr. Agaston, what I found very interesting was the story of how you came to write this book and how you got interested in this. It wasn't something you really set out to do, right?
It was fascinating because the original diet I didn't set out to do either. I was sometimes called the accidental diet doctor. It was my primary interest was preventing heart attacks and strokes, and diet was part of that puzzle. And when I became interested in the prediabetes metabolic syndrome phenomenon in this country, which I thought was causing most of the obesity, it led to the original South Beach diet. And the original South Beach diet in the first phase, which lasts 2 weeks, was always grain-free to get rid of swings in blood sugar and cravings so people could lose weight easily and quickly without feeling they were starving themselves. And while it was intentionally grain-free, it turned out to be unintentionally gluten-free because gluten is in, of course, all the wheat, rye, and barley grains. And we would see some incredible results in phase one. We saw juvenile arthritis and other types of arthritis resolve and psoriasis clear up, and many things that, while I was very happy to take credit for, I thought was more than just the weight loss and reversal of prediabetes. And I eventually realized, partly because of experience with my uncle who was diagnosed with celiac disease, the extreme form of a gluten problem in his 70s, I became aware of gluten problems and finally decided that the gluten-free part of the first phase of the South Beach diet was why many people had bursts of energy and resolved various medical conditions and often didn't want to go to the second phase of the diet. I always thought it was the faster weight loss, but I eventually realized part of it that people were just feeling much better without gluten. And so then I started taking people off gluten specifically, particularly those with GI problems and chronic headaches and arthritic problems and heartburn and rashes and skin irritations. And I was truly just amazed by the results and thought I'd better start telling the world about it.
And Dr. Agaston, one of the things, too, I noticed was with your uncle, it took years to diagnose him, and he had some really serious health problems. It really, really badly reduced his quality of life. So does that happen frequently? And then let me ask you about some of the symptoms people might feel if they are having a gluten problem.
For both, it's known with celiac disease, which is the extreme form of gluten sensitivity. It's 1% of the population. That's what my uncle had. That it's often years before a diagnosis was made. And even in retrospect, he was diagnosed with the beginning of blood sugar problems despite a good diet about 20 years before he was diagnosed with celiac disease. And he was eventually diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease. That's disease where your body cells attack each other. That is associated with celiac and gluten problems. So that was a manifestation of a gluten problem 20 years before it was diagnosed. And in our practice, we've had patients with various problems. They've been told of rheumatoid arthritis, of lupus, of all kinds of problems for 10, 20, 30 years, some since childhood, who are in their 50s and 60s now, who are then absolutely cured when they're taking off gluten. It's almost hard to believe until you see it.
Right. Well, and it's even hard to believe when you do it, because that was one of the first things I did when we had health issues in our family that we had to resolve, and that was one of the first things besides switching to a whole foods diet. And it worked very well, but after a while you start thinking, well, maybe it really wasn't, that. But so what are some of the symptoms that people might be feeling if they have some gluten sensitivity?
Yeah, well, we separate into what we call the gluten trifecta to three sources of symptoms. First, the problem with gluten is the protein in wheat. And it's different than proteins in rice and meat and other proteins in that it's difficult to digest. And if it's not completely digested, it causes inflammation and damage to the small intestine where all of our nutrients are absorbed. And that local inflammation causes stomach problems, cramping, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, heartburn. And then when there's in areas of inflammation, it blocks the absorption of certain nutrients. So if it's in an area of your small intestine that absorbs calcium, you can end up with osteoporosis. And I think that's actually the source of quite a bit of osteoporosis in America. If it's in an area where iron is absorbed, you can develop iron deficiency anemia, which is usually due to blood loss and loss of iron from bleeding, but you may also not be absorbing the irons normally. If it's B vitamins, you can be exhausted. You can have numbness. So they're all different problems you can have from not absorbing the nutrients from gluten problems. And then finally, some of the partially digested gluten gets into our tissues. It penetrates through the lining of our guts and causes an immune reaction, and some of those gluten fragments can mimic our own tissues. And if it looks like thyroid, we attack our own thyroid. And many people with thyroid problems, inflammation of the thyroid, it can be gluten-related. It's autoimmune. If it attacks the pancreas, you get type 1 diabetes like my uncle. It often attacks joints and causes all types of arthritic pains. It may attack the brain and cause headaches. So it can really hit any system, and it can present to any doctor. I mean, you can present to the neurologist with headaches and numbness, and the endocrinologist with a thyroid problem, and the GI guy with abdominal problems, and it really, a hematologist with anemia. It really cuts through all the specialties, and often the individual specialist does not put everything together and realize it's a problem that can be cured without taking any pills at all, just by avoiding gluten.
And that is just phenomenal to realize that such a simple solution is available to a lot of people. I'm Chris Costello, and today we're talking with Dr. Arthur Agaston, author of the South Beach Diet Gluten Solution. And we're going to kind of dive down a little more into how do people know if they have gluten sensitivity, if it's causing problems. I know for us, we just went cold turkey and we cut it out of our lives for about a year. And then I went to see the movie Bedtime Stories with the gluten-free mom in there, and it just freaked me out. Did you see that one?
Yes.
I thought, that's me. And oh, no, So it's a tricky thing. But Dr. Agaston, how do people figure out if this is something they really need to look at?
We have to reiterate that the two major gluten problems we're talking about are celiac disease, which is 1% of the population, which is 3 million Americans, and that you can test with a blood test. There are often stomach symptoms, but sometimes it could be arthritic symptoms, headaches, and so you should see your doctor. It's a simple blood test to rule it out. If the blood test is positive, then you may need an upper endoscopy, a small bowel biopsy as well. But for the majority of Americans with gluten problems, there is no blood test. The only thing to do, and some people claim their tests, right now there are no definitive tests. And so the only thing to do is to avoid gluten. And being strictly gluten-free is difficult to do for a lifetime. And if you're a celiac patient, that's what you have to do. If you only have gluten sensitivity, then you just have to be what we call gluten aware. But we recommend for a month being strictly gluten-free. And any symptoms you have should disappear. And often there's a big burst of energy. Your skin looks better. Your joints feel better. You focus better. It's really incredible. And if there's any question whether you think it's just a placebo effect, what you can do is have a big bowl of pasta or a few slices of bread, and your symptoms will come back very, very rapidly. So that's a re-challenge. And so that's what we recommend to see whether you do have a gluten problem. And then if you do feel better, the difference, again, if you're gluten sensitive, you don't have celiac disease, is you can add back some sources of gluten. If they're in tomato sauce or a soy sauce, or you just love a slice of whole grain toast in the morning, you may be able to get away with it. There's a spectrum of gluten sensitivities, and some people with just a little gluten wake up in the morning and feel like they've been hit by a bus and exhausted, and for others it takes more gluten to feel the symptoms, or they'll just feel better, have more energy when they're avoiding most sources of gluten, but they don't have to be worried about the hidden sources.
And do we have any idea why some people react so strongly to it and then others, it's not a problem?
Well, we certainly know it's an immune reaction, and for people who have celiac disease, the extreme form, they definitely have a genetic predisposition, and there are genetic tests for that. And so their immune system reacts. It's not an allergy, but it's as if you almost had a peanut allergy. You get a little peanut and you have a strong reaction. So somebody with celiac, just there's gluten in the capsules of some pills, and that can make them sick. With others who are intolerant, it's analogous to some people familiar, or many are, with lactose intolerance from milk products, and many people can have a splash of milk in their coffee, no problem. But if they have an ice cream sundae, they're up all night with abdominal cramps. And it's similar. It's our ability to digest the gluten. And if we don't have a lot of enzymes, and it's partly bacteria in our gut that help us digest gluten, and if that's been knocked out by anti-inflammatory drugs, by antibiotics, and they digest gluten very poorly, then a little gluten will make them sick. For others with just a small deficiency of enzyme, they can have more gluten before they have symptoms. So we think it's the ability to digest the gluten that makes a difference.
And does supplementing with enzymes help with that also? Is that part of it that you
They're not
prescribe?
enzymes you can supplement. We think that probiotics that have what's happened in America, one of the reasons why you hear so much about gluten problems now, there are several reasons. One is gluten has been used as an additive in so many products, from toothpaste to lipstick to tomato sauce and soy sauce. It's all over. But the other thing is all the antibiotics and the anti-inflammatory drugs that we take have destroyed some of our healthy bacteria that help us digest gluten. And so with the abuse of antibiotics, we don't have the good bacteria that help us absorb it. And I have seen patients develop all kinds of gluten problems after a long course of antibiotics. So one theory is if you take a probiotic and replace some of the good bacteria, you'll do better. That's something that we believe makes sense, but the final proof is not there. The message here is not to take antibiotics unless you really need it.
And so, Dr. Agaston, if people want to find that list, like you said, that list is phenomenal in your book, The South Beach Diet Gluten Solution, on all the foods that have gluten in them. It's things you would never even think of, and it's a long list, right?
Yes, it's a long list, and we have it on our website also, the southbeachdiet.com, and you can also get help from nutritionists there as well to start being gluten-free, or as we like to say, gluten-aware.
And we are talking with Arthur Agaston. Dr. Agaston is author of The South Beach Diet Gluten Solution, and it's a great book, very comprehensive. I wish I had read it when we went gluten-free about 8 years ago. I didn't even know there was gluten hidden in little things like ketchup and soy sauce. Dr. Agaston, one of the big things that parents are concerned about these days is their children and the behavior. There's so many kids on drugs for ADHD. There's so many people struggling with autism and Asperger's syndrome, and just the lifestyle in general. What is going on? And I know you've seen a lot of this with treating patients with gluten sensitivities and the work you've done.
Yes, Kristen, my co-author, Dr. Natalie Geary, is a pediatrician who spent 10 years in a big pediatric practice in New York, often taking kids off wheat with attention deficit problems and many other problems that when I grew up, I'm a little bit older, when I grew up, kids didn't have asthma and all the ear infections and the sinus problems and eczema, and ADHD was not a problem. Either was autism or Asperger's. And while we can't say all that will be cured, a lot of it is cured when you take kids off gluten, particularly the attention deficit problems, a lot of problems related to mucus, including chronic ear infections, mild cases of asthma, eczeema, are much better. Naturally with autism, it's a tougher shot, but a lot of doctors specializing in autism do give kids at least a trial off of gluten, and the final evidence is not in. But it's because our kids take so many more antibiotics and often anti-inflammatory drugs that kids did not take in earlier generations. And also, it's just some of the bacteria, the healthy bacteria. We always think of bacteria as the enemy and germs, but a lot of bacteria are good bacteria. We pick them up in the birth canal when we're born, and we're missing a lot of our good bacteria compared to earlier generations. And some of these bacteria help us digest gluten, and because we don't have them, we're not digesting gluten as well as earlier generations did. So particularly for kids with any of these problems we mentioned, it's worth a try off gluten.
And Dr. Agaston, you've been treating patients for years with these kinds of issues, and one of the challenging things I think for parents when they're told, oh yes, try gluten-free, is just the freak out factor of, what is my child going to eat? They take a kid that's eaten macaroni and cake and, unhealthy things like that. And how do you see the most successful parents managing this transition?
Well, here I have to quote Dr. Geary, the pediatrician who worked with me, and the story, because I don't treat kids specifically, although a lot of friends' kids have done very well with less gluten. And what Dr. Geary emphasizes is if a kid has celiac disease, so if they have GI and stomach and other problems, they should be tested by their pediatrician. And there are simple blood tests. If they do not have celiac disease, but they have gluten sensitivity, then they should avoid gluten. But what Dr. Geary always says, if they're going to a birthday party, let them have the birthday cake and the pizza. They may have a tummy ache or not concentrate as well after, but make sure they're with as little gluten as possible the day before, the day after, to get back on track. If they do have celiac, then when they go to the birthday party, everybody has to know they cannot have any grains and any wheat-based grains at all. And so there's a difference. But for those with gluten sensitivity, in particular, there are a lot of foods. I mean, they can have rice, they can have potatoes, they can have corn. So they're even starches. I mean, we don't like the processed grains in general.
Right, and it's important to emphasize also that it's not just a quick switch to buying all the gluten-free foods, right? Because some of those aren't necessarily that good for you either.
Yes, we have a chapter in the book called, I think, Junk Food by Any Other Name. And just like this was part of the origin of the original South Beach diet, that experts said just get the fat out of our diet. And if you get the fat out, anything is fine. And we started eating all the processed carbohydrates, often these horrible foods with starches and sugars that were cholesterol-free and fat-free, but they were very bad for us. Well, a lot of the gluten-free foods were developed for patients with celiac disease who tend to be malnourished, and their whole challenge, because they're so sensitive, is staying away from gluten completely. That's the first 3 rules. And again, they're malnourished, so that if they get a few extra calories, it's not such a big deal. But what we see in adults and kids who are off gluten, if they just buy gluten-free products made with white rice flour and sugars, they're still having junk food, and they can put on weight, and they can still be sick and be pre-diabetic. So just because it's gluten-free doesn't mean you don't still have to read the label and make sure you're getting whole. The best prescription is whole food.
Right, not processed. Keywords, right?
Not processed. Absolutely.
If you guys want to hear more about what Dr. Agaston is doing and his wonderful work, you can go to southbeachdiet.com. Dr. Agaston, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing about more about your work.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be with you.